Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's first segment, we're going to discuss Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the corruption cases and bribery cases against him. He has now been property charged, and in fact, those charges have been property unveiled, I should say. In fact, those charges including bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Those are three separate corruption cases that the Israeli Attorney General announced on Thursday evening. This is the first time that a sitting Israeli Prime Minister has been or is facing indictment in criminal investigations. Now, in the past, we have seen, of course, the likes of Ehud Olmert also facing corruption trials as well, but not while he was, of course, sitting prime minister. He was, in fact, I believe, charged, and those charges went through, and he was, in fact, held to account for that. Now, obviously, all of this is very internal Israeli politics, but it still does, in some ways, I imagine, affect the occupation as well, the ongoing occupation of Palestinian lands, and how that entire situation works out, especially how Netanyahu views his legacy vis-a-vis his leadership of Israel, of course, his long-standing leadership, one should say, of course, of Israel also. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're joined now by Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's joining us now from Jerusalem. Joining us from Berlin is Joel Schalit, who is an Israeli-American journalist, editor of the Battleground.eu, and is also the author of several books, including Israel versus Utopia and Jerusalem Calling. Joel and Jeff, thank you both for your time today. Joel, let me start. What do you make of these corruption cases against Netanyahu? Do you think that in many ways his legacy will now be stained, even just within the Israeli people's eyes?
No, I don't think that's been decided at all. I think Netanyahu intends to outlive these charges, survive these charges, and continue as prime minister in whatever new configuration he can fangle through his allies in the Knesset. And I believe he might. I think that the opposition that he's facing from Kahal Lavan is just another version of Likud. And Netanyahu has been a very successful steward of the Israeli economy with a lot of support from the private sector, and in particular, a lot of support from the diaspora, including both Jewish and non-Jewish supporters of Israel abroad, who have very dramatic political, cultural, and economic stakes in Netanyahu's preferred version of Israel, the one that we've lived with for the last decade.
Jeff, do you agree with that? Do you think Netanyahu will survive this?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Joel is right. He certainly has ways of staying in power. But I think the Israeli public is tired of Netanyahu. You know, he didn't do well in the last elections. He didn't do as well as Gantz. He didn't do well in the election before. And the fear of his party, the Likud party, which is why there's internal tensions to begin to remove him, is that if there's a third round of elections, he's going to be punished, he and the Likud. So I think actually he's on his way out. It could be within the next week, because we have one more week before actually we have to decide whether to go to a third round of elections. He's not very strong. You know, it's true he did something with the economy, although the economy is a neoliberal economy. So, you know, it's kind of good for the middle class or the upper middle class. It's not good for everyone. The health system is not good. The security situation certainly isn't good. In a way, he's like Shamir. Shamir is known as a prime minister with no legacy. You mentioned the word legacy. You know, he was there. He was tough. He never negotiated. He never moved. He was very proud of it. And then he was the end of stopped as prime minister, and that was the end. There was no legacy. There was nothing. And I think Netanyahu is like that. Besides some economic successes in the sense of getting Israel a little bit into the 21st century in a neoliberal way, he hasn't had great successes in security and economy and society. And he's not that popular, I think, with the public.
Do you think, Joel, that it'd be wonderful for Netanyahu's legacy if he were to actually be able to come to sort of a peace deal with the Palestinians?
Netanyahu never will come to a peace deal with the Palestinians. I don't think that's even in the cards. He has no interest in a settlement with the Palestinians, even as a way of securing his position moving forward. There's no incentive for him to do so. I think Jeff is correct. Netanyahu is in a state of insecurity, but and his power is in to some extent tentative in ways that it has not been before. But taking a hard line with the Palestinians and continuing to remain, stuck in a frozen peace process is to his electoral benefit. He's not going to make
Isn't
any
that then a
moves.
sad judgment in some ways then, Joel, on the electorate?
For sure, for his constituency. I mean, if you look at all the opinion polls done about how the Israeli electorate feels about a potential peace deal with the Palestinians, generally you see indicators going 50-50 either way, but generally it's the non-peace camp that always prevails, so to speak, in the final estimate of things. And so, I think that the Israeli electorate is locked in its own bubble regarding the Palestinians, and can live with the status quo that is relatively quiet without a peace deal.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on that? Because I wondered about whether, if Netanyahu, from the moment really these charges were spoken of and brought forth, I always thought that would push him further, possibly to this deal of the century that Jared Kushner and others have presented. But it doesn't seem that that's happening. Is it? Do you think, as Joel there said, it would be essentially political suicide for him because his at least voting base would not agree with him on that?
Yeah, look, you have to understand Netanyahu is really an extremist. And I don't mean just in terms of a political ideology. He really believes, he got this from his father, that we're in a kind of another pre-Holocaust period. And you have Iran and you have everybody in the world against Israel. It's a paranoid way of looking at the world. And the Palestinians are a part of this evil that's against Israel. I mean, that's really part of his worldview. That's one reason why peace is inconceivable. It isn't a political issue for him. It's an existential issue. And so, in a sense, I think he would think that on the one hand, if we can avoid any kind of peace that he would see as becoming more vulnerable, giving in, almost putting Israel at the risk of existential death by its enemies, that if he can avoid that, that's good. But also, I think Israel believes that it can win, that it can beat the Palestinians. It has beat the Palestinians. They've been marginalized. They have nowhere else to go. There'll never be a Palestinian state. And so it's just a matter of holding on until the time when this all disappears from the political map and Israel can move on. So I think he sees his legacy as actually, dealing finally with the Palestinians, but in a way that removes them from his.
Interesting. Joel, I wonder if it is on the part of Israelis, embarrassing that they would have a family like the Netanyahus, and I'm talking about all of them at this point, because, it's not just Benjamin Netanyahu who has these corruption cases and these just cases against him. We also have Sarah Netanyahu's cases, which we've had recently, of course, as well, about, abuse towards workers, etc. And then we've had Netanyahu's son, who's obviously tweeted a whole bunch of things in the past, which have been, very unsavory and very unbecoming of somebody who is the son of the leader of Israel. Do you think the Israeli establishment at some level must want them to just sort of disappear or to just go behind the scenes right now?
Yeah, I appreciate you raising also the example of Yair Netanyahu, because he's extremely embarrassing. There is a certain tolerance for corruption in Israeli political culture. We've had a lot of corrupt political leaders and a lot of political leaders who have, quote unquote, misbehaved along the lines of, Western standards. It's shocking to a large degree, particularly since Sharon, what Israeli leaders are able to do in public and how much they violate the sensibilities of Western centrists and even people on the Western center right. And I think that we just tend to look the other way when somebody like Netanyahu does something especially egregious, or when his family is out of line and beats up on the help staff or orders too much ice cream on the public budget. Yeah. It's part of the landscape. We live with it. We should be more oriented towards rejecting a political culture that accepts this, but we're not.
And why do you think this political culture is accepted, Jeff?
Well, this goes wider than Israel. All over the world, the left has kind of disappeared. And there isn't much of an alternative. I don't think Netanyahu would last very long if there was another Rabin, let's say, who's not super left, but, certainly an alternative. Or, if there was a left, I don't know about a Corbyn or a Bernie Sanders, but if there was a left-oriented Israeli who was articulate and who was seen as prime minister material with an ideology, I think that Netanyahu and his gang could be not so in a not so difficult way pushed aside. Don't forget, in 2006, I think it was, the Likud got 12 seats in the elections out of 120, 10% of the vote. So it's not that they're so rooted in Israeli society. It's simply that there's a political vacuum. And in that political vacuum, even in the Likud, besides this one figure, Gideon Sa'ar, there's no successor to Netanyahu either in the Likud. In other words, that's in a way where Israel has fallen, in that this one corrupt guy who nevertheless is skilled speaking and he's a good manipulator and he looks well, he looks prime ministerial, has managed to capture the stage because he's the only one. There's a paucity of leadership and certainly of alternative left ideology in Israel. And I think he just fills that vacuum by inertia, basically.
So then what does this do, Joel, for the relationship with the United States? I mean, right now, obviously, we have Donald Trump in office, and seemingly the moment he came in, and obviously this has been said for previous U.S. presidents as well, he seemingly gave carte blanche to Israel, and, settlement building is going on unabated, and now the U.S. has said those settlements, especially in the occupied West Bank, are not illegal. They're essentially legalizing it in its own terms. The EU obviously disagreeing with it. But I mean, in the sense, do you think that this sort of Netanyahu sort of staying in office is being helped along because Trump is also in office? Do they sort of work off each other in some ways?
Absolutely. One has to understand that the kind of Tea Party demeanor of Netanyahu, or Jewish Tea Party demeanor that he projects, is really welcome by the Americans, and in particular, really welcome by the GOP. They want to have a Jewish politics that looks like their unruly conservative politics that leans towards the far right. The more that they can look to Israel for examples of political behavior more approximate to right-wing Republican religious behavior, the more that they can claim the allegiance of the Jewish electorate in the U.S. And that's an enormous reason why Republican presidents tend to invest heavily in Israeli political leaders like Benjamin Netanyahu. They think that in Israel, they have an example of how they can remold the American Jewish electorate. And as long as Trump remains in office, there will be, a level of support for the Likud and for Netanyahu that he wouldn't get from a Democratic president. Just look at how difficult his relations were with Barack Obama. They were terrible. I mean, Obama still gave us all the military support and economic support we asked for. But Obama had a very frosty relationship with Bibi and would have preferred to see, Bibi act more like Rabin than Bibi, so.
All right. So Jeff, if in a hypothetical situation Hillary Clinton was today U.S. president, do you think that Netanyahu wouldn't still feel as confident in his position as Israeli prime minister with all the scandals and with the entire atmosphere that's currently in place because of Donald Trump?
Look, Trump is an extreme example, and his crazy ultimate deal is just weird. That's all it is. But if you go back into American diplomatic history, both parties have been super pro-Israel. And as a matter of fact, the Democratic Party has been more pro-Israel than the Republicans, especially until the rise of the Christian Zionist right. Hillary Clinton, look at Biden. Biden absolutely will not harbor any criticism of Israel. And they're into the two-state solution, which is just an illusion, of course. It's conflict management. So Israel has nothing to fear from an American president. And also, you have to understand in the United States, that really is, and this is the Obama case, Israel's really, its rock of support is Congress in a bipartisan way. It isn't really the president. It can thumb its nose at the president. It humiliated George Bush, the son. It humiliated Colin Powell when he came here once. They've humiliated Condoleezza Rice when she came here by announcing settlements when she was here. Because it has its rock-solid base in Congress. And just one more thing to mention. I talk about global Palestine. And that is that one of the strengths of Netanyahu, of course, and Joel kind of mentions this a little bit, is that he's become really a leader of the global right wing, not just Trump and the Americans. You know, Bolsonaro, Orban, Le Pen, Poland, Austria, Italy, you know, Modi in India. You know, in other words, in a way, to put China even in the right, in a certain sort of a way. You know, he's really become a galvanizing force in a very extreme nationalist far right global coalition that I think we don't appreciate. It's not simply a local Israeli matter. This really has global implications.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave that as a final point, but of course we do appreciate Joel and Jeff for their time today, and of course for giving this important context on this issue, because as both Joel and Jeff there mentioned, viewers, Netanyahu is certainly someone who seemingly his leadership and his right-wing views go across the world, really, not just within Israel or the occupied territories. And these corruption cases against him are not just against him. There are cases against his wife. His son is, as I put to Joel as well, is not exactly a very nice person, especially when it comes to his Twitter feed and the opinions that he espouses there, especially. But this family is still standing strong at this time in a leadership position within Israel. Why is that? What does it say about the Israeli population at this time also? Will Netanyahu survive this? He is somebody who has survived a lot of scandals in the past as well, and he may very well come out of this. He has been scathed in some way, though, and stained, but we'll wait and see, of course, how these charges play out in the courts, and if a sitting prime minister in Israel can really function with the sort of indictments that we have seen now placed against him. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the United Nations, which has been accused of trying to starve out refugees and asylum seekers who are sheltering for safety in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. Upwards of 400 people have been currently without food for weeks, plural. What exactly is the UN's game plan here? Why is it trying to starve out these people? Is it sort of just trying to get itself rid of these people who have become a quote-unquote headache for the international organization? We know that the refugee crisis has become a headache for many countries around the world. Is it those countries that are pressurizing this international organization to do something about these refugees and make them just go away, really? And is that the way to deal with the situation for an organization, especially that talks so much about human rights and humanitarian issues around the world? Let's discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who is a political analyst. He's at Kingston University. He's also the author of The Privatization of Warfare, and he's joining us now from London. Nicolai, as always, thanks for your time. What do you make of these? I mean, it's quite disturbing that the UN would essentially be intentionally starving 400 plus people at a detention camp, or not a detention camp, but a refugee camp in Tripoli.
It is quite shocking. I believe there were leaked internal memos regarding what's been happening. We should remember that Libya, for a start, is a huge site for many refugees seeking to cross into Europe via the Mediterranean. At the same time, of course, that doesn't excuse this behavior. This is an international organization that is meant to safeguard universal human rights, and here they are doing the opposite of that. You're quite right, as you said earlier, the idea that Western governments see refugees, people who are innocent, as a headache, that's quite disturbing, and I feel that the UN reflects that notion. We are seeing within the EU walls coming up both symbolically and literally, and what we see now with the UN in Libya, we're seeing a preemptive move. So we're not talking border control, we're talking preventing people from being able to cross in the first place. And in this case, also saying, we're going to get rid of these people no matter what. Starving them out, sadly, does not surprise me when we're talking about, according to various reports, of a situation in which the UN has offered some refugees small stipends to live in Tripoli, despite the fact that it's not safe to do so. So, you're basically either you're stuck in a detention facility, and I use that word on purpose here, where it's not sanitary, you're being starved out, or you're on the streets where there's the risk of militias being kidnapped, being recruited, forcibly recruited by militias, and forced to sometimes fight their battles. Libya is not safe. An international organization like the UN is meant to be there for peacekeeping and humanitarian reasons, and they're doing the opposite right now.
I mean, I imagine the United Nations, Nicolai, as you alluded to already, would argue that, listen, we're only as good as the member states, right? So if the member states want to push us one way, we're going to have to go that way because that's where our funding comes from as well. So this really goes then to the international community, right? And how all of us really around the world and the many countries, the Western countries especially, and European countries, how they've responded to this situation. Is it really down to them mainly, do you think?
Well, there is the issue of funding, donations. Where's the money coming from? A lot of it is coming via the EU. And so, of course, as you said, the problem is if EU states are taking a harder stance, that could put the UN in a difficult situation. At the same time, I think that it's very interesting that these memos were leaked by people who have worked high up within the organization. They're anonymous whistleblowers here. They have worked for or with the UN. That means that there are people high up who are saying, well, this is not acceptable. And I think we should listen to those voices. The refugee crisis, the way it's presented by various media, especially Western, it's presented as a crisis of numbers as opposed to being humanized. And I think that we see this very directly with the United Nations. We're talking about innocent people who've been forced to flee. And often various press outlets have talked almost from the beginning about how it's a threat to Western culture or we don't have the resources. Very few people have focused on the plight of innocence. The United Nations and various international organizations that came about after 2 world wars, we're talking about trying to safeguard basic freedoms, basic safety. They're not doing that here. This is not universal human rights. And so the EU may hit back and say, we don't have the resources. I would question that. If you have the resources to build a wall, you have the resources to try to let people in.
Exactly. I wonder also about the root causes. I mean, no one wants to leave their homeland unless, of course, they are suffering persecution, war. I mean, there are obviously some economic migrants amongst those who are probably looking for a better life. But that is also, of course, something which we can argue is down to the international community also. And many of these countries, of course, previous colonies. I mean, the list is really endless for the responsibility of the international community and why these situations arise, foreign policies, wars, etc. Do you think all of the above needs to be spoken about more also, and these countries, these very countries who may be rejecting many of these refugees and asylum seekers need to actually review their past and present policies towards those countries?
Without a doubt. I mean, you've mentioned colonialism here, and I think that's a very strong and powerful word to use regarding former and current policies of Western governments. Why is it, for example, that Assad remains in power? Why is it that Syria is the way it is in? Let's not forget that many of our governments in the West have supported dictatorships in the past. And by the way, while we're on the topic, I would like to bring up the fact that some of the arguments used by certain dictators to stay in power, such as, without me, there'll be a refugee crisis, we now see that narrative being picked up by Western and international organizations that, oh, there is a refugee crisis and we have to block these people from coming. So I think that a lot of our governments need to take a long, hard look at their legacies of interference in, for example, the Middle East and who they've been supporting for reasons that on paper seem to be about safety, but really they're supporting suppression and they're supporting or funding directly and indirectly various civil wars and various forms of what we could now call anarchy. And this is hurting innocent people.
And then it also comes down to people like you and I, it does at some level, Nicolai, because, I mean, we know this is happening to innocent people. Do you think enough of us, lay people, are aware of really what's happening, A, and B, that we'd actually be willing to do something, put pressure on our respective governments to actually act in some fashion to then preserve the human rights of all these people?
Well, that's another thing. I mean, the question for me also becomes, does the attitude of EU leaderships reflect the attitude of their citizens towards refugees and towards human rights, which is, I think, disturbing. In some cases, I do believe for many people, out of sight, out of mind, quite sadly so. Maybe we need to take a long, hard look at how we approach universal human rights or not. At the same time, if we're living in Western governments, if we're under the rule of Western governments, we are supposed to live in so-called democracies. That should mean that we hold more governments accountable. For example, if we look at Mohammed bin Salman meeting Theresa May, the former Prime Minister of England, there were protests, there were people who were calling her out for it. This needs to happen more often. I mean, we should have more people power, not just people educating themselves about what's happening, but actually saying to their governments, this is not acceptable.
And going back to the UN, if we may for a moment, Nicolai, because I wonder, with the many scandals that the UN has seen in recent years, there have been so many. I mean, there's hard to put them all into, a list really, but then Haiti and, there's been sexual abuse scandals across Africa as well with the United Nations. What do you think is going wrong with that organization and how it's dealing how its daily dealings are occurring really around the world? Is it a question of leadership? Is it a question of hierarchy? Is it just a question of how it operates and what its standards are?
I think it's a question of those factors, yes, but also there's a certain amount of whitewashing. I feel that there have been attempts to ignore or cover up what's occurred in the past, where people within the leadership itself have ignored what's been happening when it's been broken. I mean, this is why we have anonymous sources breaking such scandals. Already, certainly in the Middle East, from my own experience, if you were to ask people on the ground what they think of the UN, they will basically say that they don't necessarily have trust in that organization for a variety of reasons. It's not just about the scandals. It's also about how, let's remember, international organizations, on paper they're international, but they are often run by Western leaderships, Western-linked firms and whatnot. Now, I have had meetings with certain NGOs who have gone into Syria, okay? And when I've sat in these meetings, I don't see a single Syrian person sitting in that room. I don't see people from that culture sitting in that room. So I think that, setting aside the scandals themselves, I think we also need to ask ourselves, are these organizations connecting with the communities they want to go into? Are they meeting needs? Are they being respectful to the cultures that exist there? Do they understand these cultures? That on top of the scandal as well. The problem with the scandals is that this really breaks any trust that could have been created within Libya, Jordan, and anywhere else where they want to be present. That's an issue they have to solve. And I think there'll be more and more pressure as further news comes out. There's going to be a long, hard look at the UN today compared to when it was first founded.
That's a very good point to conclude on. We're at that, but of course, as always, Nicolai, we appreciate your time and, of course, your insight. The United Nations, viewers, is an organization that is meant to be a humanitarian, that is meant to support human rights of people around the world. For it to then want to starve out people from a refugee camp in a country, especially like Libya, which is going through its own upheaval and is insecure for anybody really, just within Libya itself, not speaking of then, of course, refugees who are coming from outside Libya who are seeking to then move on to places like Europe or otherwise, using Libya as, a departure or destination to leave from. That's obviously quite disturbing. And within these 400 people that I mentioned earlier in my introduction, there are 100 minors among them that are being starved as we speak, really. They haven't been given food for weeks. And this is, of course, as Nicolai said, a leaked memo that had come out. And the International Organization for Migration has also spoken about this, saying this is disturbing as well. What will the UN do? Why is the UN acting in this fashion, where it is going against its very raison d'etre? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment, though, after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Julian Assange. Now, the UN rights expert, the UN Special Rapporteur, on torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, Nils Melzer, has said that the United States, Britain, Ecuador, and Sweden have collectively persecuted the WikiLeaks founder, Julian Assange, and have subjected him to drawn-out psychological torture, especially in a UK jail where he currently sits. He's also obviously set to be extradited to the US if that does go through, if that extradition request is successful at this time. There he would risk the death penalty as well, which is also, of course, something that would be an important case of international law and whether that should even be allowed. Sweden, as we well know, has withdrawn the rape case at this time. But all of this really comes down to the precedent that is being set at this point in time for journalists and other whistleblowers around the world in how Julian Assange is being treated. Whistleblowing at some levels is celebrated and allowed for in many countries, especially in Western countries, where Julian Assange, of course, carried out the kind of whistleblowing work that he did, which was very important and vital. One can remember, of course, with the many videos that have come out about the Iraq War and others. So let's discuss this a bit further. We're joined now by our panelists. Mark Worth is the Executive Director of the Whistleblowing International and the European Centre for Whistleblower Rights. He's joining us now from Berlin. Joining us from Liverpool is David Lowe, who is Senior Research Fellow at Leeds Beckett University Law School. He researches terrorism, security, policing, and criminal law. David and Mark, thank you both for your time today. Mark, let me start with you. What do you make of the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture now speaking out about how Assange is being treated? Obviously, it's not his first time that he's spoken out about this, but do you agree with him that Assange is essentially being tortured?
Oh, I wouldn't have any idea. I've never met Mr. Assange. I don't know how many of the doctors actually personally examined Mr. Assange. I don't know the conditions in the prison or jail in the UK. But I think that you raise a broader point, which is when you have a figure like Julian Assange, who universally is considered a cultural icon, a revolutionary figure. The question is, what is the response from the establishment, from the institutions, from the media, when someone steps so far out of the norms and sets a new standard for access to information? And in my personal view, I would call Mr. Assange an access to information activist, separate from a journalist and separate from a whistleblower. His crusade, his mission in his adult life has been access to information, regardless of whether or not the information exposes wrongdoing. He's been criticized for not redacting information, just putting out information in its whole form. So he's a completely unique figure in our time. But let me say that if you are in a position to be a hero, to be revolutionary, you have to act responsibly. You have to understand that that there can be costs with that. Many whistleblowers who I work with fully expect to be charged or retaliated against in other ways. They realize that, they understand that. So I think from Mr. Assange's personal point of view, he has to come to grips with the fact that if he was not aware that he could face consequences for what he's doing, then he's very, very naive.
What do you make of that, David? Because as Mark there said, of course, access to information is something which a lot of us, of course, hold very dear. Do you think that this is sort of being used as an example, Assange is being made an example of, to sort of limit that sort of access?
There were good points that Mark made there, and some that I agree with. He doesn't seem to be the normal type of whistleblower, if you like. He's certainly not a journalist. But there's a couple of issues. I mean, I was quite surprised, really, when I saw this report about his torture. A lot of this is at his own doorstep. There were serious issues there. The statute of limitations went in Sweden, and this was over a serious allegation of rape and serious sexual misconduct, and he evaded that. And I think that's not got to be overlooked. There are potential victims there who underwent that ordeal. I think also the rapporteur is saying that on extradition, he could face the death penalty. That's incorrect. We will not in the UK extradite any citizen to the US to a state where that has the death penalty. We've signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, and under Article 2, we will not send, because we don't have the death penalty here, we will not send anyone there. A good example is Abu Hamza. That was one key issue when we were looking at his extradition, and he went to the state of New York because there's no death penalty, and the UK will not let Assange go there. So there's a couple of points I think need to be clarified. But I'm not against whistleblowers per se. You look at Edward Snowden, you look at, in effect, the good that came out from his whistleblowing. We've seen changes in legislation, not just in the UK, but in the US. We've seen changes of practice in how intelligence is used, and certainly bulk data collection. So, it's not against that. Assange, I think, has brought lots of this to his own doorstep.
All right, so then, Mark, what do you think is the lesson going forward? Because the one huge thing that Assange did for the rest of us around the world is WikiLeaks, isn't it? Where he created this platform where a lot of these documents, be it about wars or otherwise, could be spoken of very openly.
First, I want to congratulate Mr. Assange for what he's done. He has changed the world. He's motivated many, many people around the world in all regions to set up encrypted email systems, websites, Dropboxes, global leaks. All these different technological tools that people have were largely inspired by him and what Mr. Snowden did and Chelsea Manning and other people. So he deserves an incredible thank you for doing that. However, he would be treated more sympathetically by prosecution in different countries, by the public, if he was a more sympathetic character. And this is a sort of a dirty secret in the world of whistleblowing, which I've been working for over 30 years. You have to put yourself forward in a very positive light. You have to take responsibility for your actions. He does not have a good media profile. And just to follow up on what David said, the Espionage Act is a federal crime. He theoretically could be executed. There's only been one or two executions ever in the United States for the Espionage Act. That was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 for passing on nuclear secrets and other secrets to the Soviet Union. I would think there was about a 0.0% chance of Mr. Assange being executed. I think it's irresponsible. I think it's very irresponsible to suggest that is even a possibility. I think it's not too late for him to rehabilitate himself. The U.S. justice system is very human. It's very sympathetic. If you explain your actions, the judges, the juries want to know what was behind your actions. I think that Mr. Snowden has a chance to rehabilitate himself. But you cannot be a cultural hero. You cannot change the world and have a immediate profile, a media image like Mr. Assange has. He does not have enough sympathy of the public and of the prosecution and the institutions to save himself as well as he could be saved had he handled himself differently in the public eye and with his friends.
David, I imagine the argument can be made, can't it, that it's not been to any government or anybody around the world who is powerful politically or otherwise to assassinate someone's character, right? I mean, character assassination happens, certainly. And I mean, I imagine Assange would at some level say, listen, I evaded the case in Sweden because I didn't feel like I would get a fair trial, especially in the context of the fact that this was, of course, the WikiLeaks founder who would be put on trial. I mean, there'd be a lot of political ramifications there as well and political context, which would no doubt play into that trial also. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I'm making an educated guess here. I think behind Assange's move initially at that time when he was fighting the European arrest warrant to go to Sweden and he went through the UK's appeal court system, I think behind that was his fear of being extradited to the US, and that's why he went to the Ecuadorian embassy. But I think to say he wouldn't get a fair trial in Sweden is very unfair to the Swedish system. The Swedish system is like most European systems or Western systems. You are innocent until you're found guilty. It's not the other way around. And I think he would have greater public sympathy if he faced those accusations and if he claimed his innocence and was found innocent. I think he'd have greater sympathy. I mean, as I said, I'm not against whistleblowing, but I agree with Mark. If you're going to do this, you have to have some social responsibility as well and political responsibility, that if you're going to release anything per se, there could be other consequences of in what you reveal that will give methods of surveillance and that which could be useful to those who that they're looking at. So for terrorists or other states, that could be useful. There has to be that balance there. And I agree with Mark. And I don't think Assange has helped himself.
All right, so David, do you think that the likes of the Guardian newspaper and others are sort of seeing that this case of Assange as something which could come to their doorstep as well, right? Because they released, of course, as you well know, in conjunction with WikiLeaks, some of those documents also that we can obviously list out. Do you think that at some level, beyond Assange and whether or not we like him and his actions personally in his life till today or otherwise, that is being made, that he is being made an example of in some regards, and that does create a slippery slope of some sort where at some point in time, then newspapers such as The Guardian or others will then be asked to limit the kind of information that they release?
Yeah, I think you have to look at the print media in particular, because we know from their ownership which sort of political leanings they have, and The Guardian is at the moment has very left-wing leanings. You can see that in our general election. You know, the support for the Labour Party, and you know, so you have to look at that, and also The Guardian in the context of the Edward Snowden revelations, Guardian was one of the key papers that revealed this, and it's getting that balance right. So you've got to understand where they're coming from. But, you know, we have to look at the sort of wider picture and the wider balance, and certainly with the media. And I think you tend to find that normally radio, TV media, they work at being balanced. And so if you're trying to get your information and trying to make your decision on individuals, try and take that balanced approach and look at where, certainly on a print media, where their angle is coming from. Because I know in the UK, I could cite other newspapers who would take a completely opposite view to the Guardian in relation to Assange and similar cases.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll leave that as a final word. The clock has gotten the best of us, but we do appreciate both Mark and David for their time today, and of course, for putting this into context for us and giving their insight. The case of Assange, as both of our guests have said, viewers, is complicated because it's hard to like the man himself, even though the work he has done has been vital for journalists such as us around the world and just others who want access to information freely, and they want to know what their governments are doing behind the scenes, whether or not their governments are involved in war crimes or human rights violations, etc. But Assange himself has, of course, misstepped a number of times in life. Why did he evade the case in Sweden? Would he have gotten a fair trial? Those political realities also need to be taken into account. And what kind of a precedent does his treatment set for the rest of us around the world? Is this about journalism, or is this just about the man, Julian Assange, and his personal actions? Those are huge questions which remain, of course, outstanding and need to be debated regularly. We'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching this episode.